Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the iPad 7 generation and see how this iPad holds up in 2022. Now this iPad I believe was actually probably one of the more important iPads that Apple has made probably in the last few years, mostly because it did actually end up bringing a little bit of a different design. Now it wasn't really a crazy big redesign by any means, but they did end up pretty much bringing in a little bit of a bigger panel, which I was really happy about. So basically what I'm going to tell you is the iPad 7 generation, in my opinion, is still completely worth it. Of course, if you can go up to something like an iPad, 9th generation, I think that is a very good iPad. I think definitely something like the iPad Air 4 or iPad Air 5 or also the iPad Mini 6 is also a really good one. But I think this one, if you still own it, by all means keep it. It still has a pretty good future ahead of it. But by all means, if you have any sort of budget that you can be a little bit flexible with, get the iPad 9, get the iPad Air 4 or the Air 5 if you have the extra money. If not, the iPad 9th generation is a very good iPad and a good upgrade from this one. Now with this specific iPad, it came out in 2019, so it's approaching 3 years old this year. But I will tell you, the outside of this iPad doesn't seem that old. The internals of this iPad is the thing that kind of freaks me out a little bit. So on the front, 10.2 inch panel, it's an IPS panel and it's 1620 by 2160. Very high resolution panel on this iPad. And as I mentioned before, I mean, this is a, really decent looking iPad now, even in this day and age. Even though it still has a lot of bezel around it, still has, pretty thick bezels on the top and bottom. I definitely do think most of us are kind of aligned with this iPad being the cheaper iPad. So Apple's still selling the same design in the 9th generation too. So that's a thing to keep in mind. But I don't think this iPad looks like an ugly iPad by any means. I have a lightning port on this thing and a headphone jack as well. And on the back, you have the full aluminum back on this iPad, which looks pretty good. I mean, Apple, like I've stated in every single iPad video, they've never made a cheap feeling iPad. They've never made an iPad that looks cheap or really anything like that. And even with this iPad, even though it doesn't look that great, it still doesn't look like an ugly iPad. And I think this device is still a really clean looking device for sure. Now we have that single camera setup on the back too, which is really awesome. The Apple logo in the center looks really good. There isn't any, 120 hertz on this panel. There's no, wireless charging, no IP certification. No other iPad really has those things either. But definitely from a cheap iPad like this, I don't think really many people are going to expect anything like that anyway. The heft is great on this thing. It feels great. You have Apple Pencil 1 support as well, which is really cool. No Apple Pencil 2, which is pretty much the Apple Pencil I like recommending to people. But definitely on the outside, looks great. And you can get it in a couple of different colors too, which is really nice. Now in terms of the camera setup, this is also kind of an interesting thing between them. So on the back, you have an 8 megapixel camera, and on the front, you have a 1.2 megapixel camera. Now, this is basically what I tell you about this camera. It is almost the same thing as an iPhone 6 type of lens. So whatever you would do on an iPhone 6 is pretty much how this type of camera would kind of hold up in this day and age. So there's only 1080p video on the back, and there's only 720p video on the front. Now, is it a big deal? Well, it's kind of a two-part story. One, it's like if you have an iPad and it has a camera on it, I think that's great. You can just go ahead and, if you get a FaceTime call or anything, you have to take Zoom meetings or Google Meets or whatever it is, you can easily, access those via this type of iPad, which is so nice. You can just go down that route and just kind of move on from there. And I think that's a really cool thing. Unfortunately, your phone probably has a way better camera than this thing. If you have an iPhone 6S or newer, that device camera is going to be better than this type of iPad camera. So even though this thing came out in 2019, it has the same camera as the 2014 phone for the most part. So again, it's expected. I don't think Apple's going to put the best camera on this cheap iPad, but still with the iPad 9, Apple made some decent improvements, at least with the front camera. So I'll definitely tell you when it comes down to this lens, it's definitely not the first lens I would recommend to people, but I would look at this as more of like a tablet that has a camera, more of like a plus, rather than getting this iPad because of the camera. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of software, this thing is still supported with software. It has iPadOS 15. My only concern with this iPad is the software pretty much. I think the performance and everything and the build quality and the way it looks and everything is perfectly fine. However, with the software longevity, this is the thing that kind of throws me off the most. I'm not too sure how long this specific iPad is going to last, in terms of just longevity. I know it's still supported now. It's going to be supported for a few more years as well. But with that Apple A10 Fusion chip, it has the same chipset as the iPhone 7. Now, theoretically, the iPhone 7 is probably going to be the lowest supported iPhone coming up for iOS 16. So if that ends up being the case, is this iPad also going to be stopping support at iOS 16 if the iPhone 7 stops? There's been many situations before where an iPad ends up getting more versions of software extra than the iPhone with the same chipset. So the iPhone 6 and iPad mini 4, they pretty much had the same chipset, and the iPhone 6 lasted way less time than the iPad mini 4. So I'm not too sure what Apple's going to be doing here. I don't think Apple's going to do that same exact thing here either. I think Apple's probably going to support the iPad 7 generation and the iPhone 7s at the same time. So I'll be curious to see what happens here. But with the iPad, 7 generation, this is going to be a very interesting, type of longevity device and seeing how long it supports. So if you're trying to get a device that lasts the longest amount of time, this may not be it. Maybe the iPad 8 or iPad 9 are going to be better. Actually, I know for a fact those things are going to be better, but this is still going to be supported for a few more years. So I don't think it's a big deal now, but probably within a year from now, it's going to be a bigger deal. So that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of performance, this thing has the Apple A10 Fusion chip inside of it with 3 gigabytes of RAM on each model. There was the base model with 32 gigs of storage and the top tier model with 128 gigabytes of storage. Now, what I will tell you about the performance is that it's still a pretty smooth performing iPad. With the latest versions of software or even with the oldest versions of software, this type of iPad for the most part is still going to be a pretty rock solid iPad in terms of performance when you consider the price tag. Again, if you compare it to the iPad 8th generation, that's not going to be as fast, especially when you compare it to the iPad 9 generation, it's not going to be as fast or as smooth. But when you look at something like the iPad, 7th generation, this thing is still a pretty decent performing iPad for that price tag. If you're able to buy this thing for maybe like $150 or maybe $200, the amount of capability that you have behind this type of iPad is actually pretty interesting. Now, without a doubt, I would definitely tell you your iPhone 10 or above is going to be faster than this thing. Your iPhone 8 is going to be faster than this thing as well, but still, it's a pretty good performing chipset. If you're a student and you're trying to just take as many notes as possible and you're trying to go down that route, well, this thing's, performance inside is actually pretty relevant, and I think that's actually a pretty cool thing about this device. If you're trying to do, light video editing and light gaming, I think this thing is going to be more than fine enough as well. Even with the iPhone 7 that is technically less performance heavy as this thing that has 2 gigabytes of RAM, this thing has 3. Whenever I was playing Genshin Impact or really any heavy intensive game, that iPhone is able to pretty much handle everything I throw at it. With this iPad, it's pretty much a little bit, heavier intensive than that iPad, than the iPhone. So you're definitely going to be getting a rock solid iPad for that price tag. This isn't like an amazing performing iPad in this day and age, but when you consider the price tag, everything changes. So that's kind of how I kind of sum up the performance here. Again, don't get your hopes up of me telling you it's good. It's good for the price, but it's not good when compared to like an iPad Air 5 or like the M1 iPad Pros or anything, but it's a decent option if you're just on a budget and you want a decent performing iPad. Now, in terms of, the battery life within it, this thing has a 8,827 milliamp hour battery. So definitely, again, not a bad, battery life. I mean, it's a good battery size within this thing. Have there been bigger battery sizes before? Yep, but this thing is still a really good battery life inside. So it's definitely a huge pro when you're picking up an iPad like this too. So in terms of that covers it up there. And to be completely honest, I think the iPad 7th generation is still completely worth it in 2022. If you own this iPad, that is a really good starting point for the future of this device. I think if you own something like the iPad 7th generation, you're still going to have a decent supporting device for a few more years. Is it going to be perfect? Like I mentioned, probably not. You're definitely going to be getting a better device from the iPad 9, from the iPad Air 5, from the iPad, M1 iPad Pros. But for this device being what it was, for it being kind of, the cheapest iPad of 3 years ago, I think this is a decent option, and I would probably recommend you guys to pick it up for sure. Again, it wouldn't be my first choice, but if you're on a budget and if this is one of those iPads that are around you, then I would recommend just going for it. There's really not much to lose here, and if you don't like it, you can probably sell it in the next 2-3 months, and you probably won't even lose any money. So that's pretty much how to sum it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.